Hello, and welcome back to our book discussion, Liturgy of the Ordinary by Tish Harrison Warren. Our Lenten discussion for 2020, which we have extended into the coronavirus quarantine period so that we can take up each of Warren's 11 chapters. I'm Peter Pettit at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport. Delighted to be in this discussion with
Kendra Thompson, also serving at St. Paul in Davenport.
Kendra, we're looking at chapter 10 this week on drinking tea. One of the things that I learned to appreciate after my stomach refused to take any more coffee after decades and decades of too much of it. But also learning how to savor that and find some sanctuary in that. Tish Warren really leads us into that sense of abandoning ourselves, relearning the abandon of merriment and pleasure.
Yes, and she says that our children are really good at this. It's something they can teach us. That when we get too serious or overwork ourselves, our children can remind us to enjoy life. And as I'm talking to you, Peter, my children are hauling a puppet stage out of our attic, and every once in a while I hear it ka-thunk on the stairs, but I trust that they're entertaining themselves. And this time, it's a time filled with anxiety and worry. And I, for one, appreciated the reminder in this chapter to be present to the moments of glory that are showing up somewhat unexpectedly.
Yeah, indeed. I was reminded of that as we move into our slides for today, sanctuary and savoring and all the different kinds of beauty that are available to us. And I was reminded of Pastor Sarah Olsen-Smith's sermon on Sunday, where she talked about the just simplicity of enjoying the sensual pleasures of a field of red tulips, yellow daffodils, the blueness of the sky, the way in which just slowing down and appreciating creation can bring such joy. One of the quotes from Warren in this chapter is about how mysteriously and wondrously God revels even more than we do in the slight bitterness of tea, the feel of sunshine on skin, a ripe avocado, a perfect guitar lick, or a good plot twist. God is referring to the creation story in Genesis 1. God does not stoically pronounce creation good, like a disinterested manager checking off a quality checklist so we can clock out early. I love that image, that God revels in the goodness.
Yeah, that it's not a task to be completed. It's something that's been created and has unfolded and is there to enjoy.
Yeah, indeed. And how easily we lose our focus on that and get distracted from it. Warren talks about habits of inattention that consistently pull us away from those things. And then there are the things that pull us back, sometimes in the most unexpected ways and places.
Yes. Do we want to move on to our questions then for reflection here?
Sure.
So as you think about these images of beauty that we have shared with you, can you think of some of your own, some particular points of enjoyment in your life? What pulls you past them or away from them? If you want to take a minute, you can pause this video and reflect on those questions or talk with someone who's sitting there with you about these questions. Hopefully you've taken a minute to reflect on these questions, because we'd like to move on to this idea of sanctuary. because we brought up some different images and ideas of beauty, but at the center of what we want to talk about here is the fact that being people of Christian faith is about being people who admire God's work in creation and who appreciate beauty. And the spaces where we gather intentionally speak to that beauty. You know, and it's another one of those things, Peter, I'm missing right now.
Yes.
It's the whole sensory experience of being in worship.
Indeed.
So we have a couple images here and some quotes for you.
Yeah, Warren talks about the reciprocity of beauty in our daily lives and beauty in our worship spaces and our communal experience as the church, that each one helps us to understand and appreciate the other one. So focusing on what we experience in a church says at its best, church architecture accents the beauty of light and shadow, space and shape. Peek into a worship space and you'll find incense, flowers, bright whites of vestments, dancing, candles, banners, works of art, and music. Glory. We taste, we smell, we hear, we see, we feel. The way in which our spaces help teach us to see and appreciate the beauty that is all around us in creation. I think particularly in the pre-modern era, when the church, for example, was a primary place of education for the people of God. And in that education, it was the stained glass windows, and it was the soaring majesty of a cathedral. And it was in the ways in which some art or music taught the essentials of the faith. But in the process, it also taught that God's word and God's glory is available through our senses, not just by any means through our intellect.
Not only that, but it is above all what is worthy of our praise. You know, and this made me think of the idea that comes from Aristotle, but I've also heard, but read C.S. Lewis reflect on it, that this type of education is a process of ordering our affections. Yeah. And I think the church is a place of learning around this, to look at what is lifted up. You know, it's not a giant cup of tea behind the altar, Peter, at worship. It's a cross. And so reminding us that God alone is worthy of our worship and praise, and that we order our other affections, our other loves, fall behind that.
Indeed. There's Aristotle for you on the left side there. And the ways in which our worship orients us and our scriptures orient us to the senses. Psalms 34, taste and see that the Lord is good, or Paul writing to the Corinthians, your body is a temple. That these are daily experiences of eating and living in our bodies that remind us of all the gifts of God that God has given to us. And it's that ordering of the affections that through these things we come to worship and adore God. And by celebrating God in worship, we learn to celebrate as well all that God has given. Warren recalls this moment after this time after she had given birth. She was in Lent. Things were disordered in their lives, apparently. It was a very high pressure time, a lot of challenges. She went to her mentor to talk about how she was going to observe Lent. Her mentor said to her, your entire life is Lent right now. you need the discipline of pleasure. And so once a week, she went to her favorite coffee shop as her sanctuary, her holy haven, where a vanilla steamer and a good novel became her discipline for that Lent.
Yes, it's such a beautiful image. And it made me think of a book that I've read from time to time called The Artist's Way. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Peter, but it is a creative workbook for writers and artists to help them get unblocked if they're in places of not being able to create. And one of the practices is that you take your inner artist on a date. And to me, it sounds like that's what this priest suggested, is that once a week she'd do something that is just for the purpose of delighting herself. And it was simple, probably cost her $5 a week and an hour. Yeah, maybe more because of childcare. But, I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, that we need to call back to this part of ourselves that is missing out on enjoying life. There's a quote, and I know we're going to get to it later, that I love so much from this chapter. I wrote it on a chalkboard that's on my porch. But it says it takes strength to find enjoyment in the world. And boy, think about that in the context in which we're in these days. It takes some effort, but it is time well spent, and it is a worthy effort.
And in the same way that the pleasures of worship are not willy-nilly. We don't just show up and do whatever we feel like every week. They are structured. There is an order. There's a planning about it. And Warren said about her Lent at the coffee shop, it was definitely a discipline, organizing the week and the days and getting the child care so that she would be free and able to go to the coffee shop at that time. It was a discipline. It was not self-denial, but it was a discipline of pleasure and enjoyment. And that's one of the ways, I think, in which our enjoyment and our pleasure in worship helps to inform our enjoyment and our pleasure in life, to recognize that it's not always just spontaneous.
Right.
And now, especially when we have such unstructured time on our hands, learning how to build that structure for relaxation and pleasure and joy and beauty into our lives. We go back to our questions for this segment. They relate to pleasure and beauty in worship and outside it.
What parts of worship speak most powerfully to your senses? Sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell? And where else are you able to immerse yourself most fully in pleasure? Again, to relearn the abandon of revelry and merriment. So take a minute and reflect on those questions, and we'll move on to think of ourselves as curators.
Yes, curators of beauty and joy as God's priests in the world. One of the things Warren lifts up is the difference between a need pleasure and an appreciation pleasure. And the fact that when we have a need pleasure that needs to be satisfied, we go for that. We know how to go for that. But usually there's some fix and then that's been satisfied. Appreciation pleasures are ones that are sometimes harder to approach, harder to make the time for, harder to engage with. And yet, for most of those, the more time we spend with them, the more pleasure we get with them. It's not a matter of satisfying the need and moving on, but rather finding the pleasure and deepening the appreciation.
I love this idea she had of something that's not necessary, but it just delights us. Okay. And immediately I thought of, so I use cloth napkins at my house, and I like them to be pressed. They don't need to be ironed. This is not like a necessary chore. I don't have to use cloth napkins, but this is something I like. And so it's a regular rhythm in my household for me to just hang out at the ironing board. I might be watching a movie or listening to a podcast or something like that. This is something that I delight in. And I know I don't have to do it. In some ways, it's ridiculous. But it is something that I find delightful.
That's great. And again, to go back to your Aristotle reference, Warren talks about the fact that becoming obsessed with your napkins can be a problem.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if that really becomes an object unto itself, then we might want to refer you for some emotional psychological counseling. But to appreciate the orderliness of the neatness of your napkins as a gift that is received from God and therefore that can be celebrated, does this thing of learning to have and to read pleasure in proper measure, as Warren says. So to have the pleasure, but also to read it appropriately, because, back to Aristotle, God alone can be both worshiped and enjoyed. This is another Warren quote, page 138. All lesser things are meant to be enjoyed in their proper place as they flow from the God who deserves all worship. So our beauty and joy in worship help us to know the proper place of worldly beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe even give us more appreciation of the beauty we see in the world when we can see it reflected in our worship spaces and the rhythms of that ritual.
Yeah. Well, in the sense that the things we enjoy in the world are in some ways a foretaste of what it is to rejoice fully in the goodness of God, which we anticipate will come only when history comes to its fulfillment, right? So that's why she talks about this as cross-training, where finding joy in the world and finding joy in worship is a kind of cross-training to anticipate the full enjoyment of God in God's fullness when history comes to its fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's not easy. The pull of the routinized, the pull of the well-managed and the predictable is always really strong. And so we end up having to look for those places where we get drawn back into beauty, whether it's high art or low, whether it's high culture or nothing all that special, but places that pull us back to appreciate God's beauty in the world. What are some of the places where you find beauty in your world, Kendra?
Well, when we were talking about this, I mentioned, I am at home a lot. And so just different parts of the day, watching how the sunlight streams in through the windows and catches on ordinary objects. It might be a house plant or a piece of pottery on my kitchen table. It's just a simple pleasure. And I love when I catch those moments and am attentive to them. Yeah. But to contrast with that gentle image, these past few weeks I've enjoyed revisiting a genre of music known as noise rock, which is very like heavy guitar chords and lots of noise. And this particular artist that I like, the vocals are female, like very gentle female vocals. And there's just something very cathartic about listening to this kind of music.
All right, gentle female vocals over blasting, booming, rocking guitar chords.
I'll send you a song, Peter.
Sounds fascinating.
But it's been a way to let someone else's creative expression speak for my cathartic experience. Yeah. And so, these are in contrast to each other. The light on the houseplant and the noise in my ears. Yeah. But both of them somehow reflect God's beauty to me.
Yeah. have a similar kind of contrast in two of my dear loves in the world. One, a well-crafted crossword that just the themers work well and the fill is good. There's nothing forced. There's a sense of flow to it. It's not scattershot words and ideas across the grid, but rather there are some basics that hold it together and nothing that really disrupts the sense of pattern and interlocking relationship that grid so graphically represents. And that obviously, I do that sitting usually in the house on a couch. It's a very cerebral kind of activity, very sedentary and quiet. And then there's a very special kind of quiet also, and a very different kind of beauty when I get out to a golf course, and particularly one like this, TPC in Scottsdale, Arizona, that has just the majesty of creation about it. And it's been touched by human hands. Obviously, it's been carved and shaped, and for a golfer, the exquisiteness of the design is going to be obvious, diabolically exquisite sometimes. But there's something for me also about standing on a golf course like this one, or so many of them. They don't have to be the big world famous ones, but just to appreciate the way in which an architect in his or her art has worked together with God's hand in nature to craft something that can give so much pleasure over and over and over. Warren talks about us becoming what I would call adept at pleasure. The adepts are those who are well trained in a particular discipline or method in the world. Warren talks about the way in which we need to become adept pleasure and beauty and joy, not for our own sakes, but especially for the sake of God, to appreciate what God has given in the world, both to savor and as a place of sanctuary for us, but also for the sake of others. And she points us not just to becoming adept at these things for ourselves, but there's this great quote, you appreciate it too, about how we reach out to others with this. Do you want to go ahead and read it?
Sure. Being curators of beauty, pleasure, and delight is therefore an intrinsic part of our mission, a mission that recognizes the reality that truth is beautiful. My kids go to a classical Christian school that the emphasis is on truth, goodness, and beauty. And we often talk about the fact that that beauty is kind of the way that we know the other two. If we didn't observe beautiful things, we wouldn't know it was true. We wouldn't know it was good. But because it's kind of seen sometimes beauty as this lighthearted or unnecessary thing, we don't always give it the credit that it's due. But I really think it's that fulcrum that points us to worshiping God and to telling others about God's beauty.
Indeed. And our questions for this final segment relate to that. What beauty and pleasure do you feel you know and have and read the best? That is, you know how to hold it, but you also know how to read it as a part of God's good. In other words, in what are you most adept? Then looking at Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller there in the lower right, think about becoming a curator of of God's beauty for another. Whom do you know for whom you could be a curator of that blessing? Setting it before them in a way they can approach, appreciate, and begin to revel. how might you begin to do that? Take a moment to think through those questions and reflect on them. We'll stop for this afternoon with those questions and say thank you for joining us once again for Liturgy of the Ordinary. We will be on to chapter 11 next week, a chapter
Final
on...
chapter.
Good chapter? Yeah,
I said the final chapter, right?
It is. It is the chapter on sleeping and Sabbath or Shabbat. So we will hope that you'll join us again for our discussion and your own reflection when we are together for our next session. Kendra, thanks so much. It is so good, especially to talk about joy and pleasure and beauty with you in this chapter and to share the joy of our conversation.
I agree, Peter. I'm looking forward to next time.
Sounds great. Take care, everyone.